Good afternoon, everyone. My name is James Perry. I'm the Executive Dean for the Verde Valley campus, and welcome to Yavapai College. 100 years have passed since the commencement of World War I. It began in August 1914 and concluded with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles in June 1919. However, a ceasefire was called on November 11, 1918. A year later, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson proclaimed the first anniversary of November 11th as a celebration of this armistice as a day to reflect upon the service of those who have sacrificed for their country during World War I. Now we call that day Veterans Day, a day of recognition for all those who have served in this great country's armed services. In this centennial year of 2014, Yavapai College looks back to the Great War to reflect how it has shaped the present. It is my pleasure at this time to introduce Professor Jason Whitesitt, one of our very best faculty at Yavapai College, with his session entitled Tanks, Poppies, and the Old Lie, the Evolution of World War I Poetry.
Thank you, James. On a personal note, today is also the 10th anniversary of the Second Battle of Fallujah, which was the largest battle of the Iraq War, and my brother got a Purple Heart in that battle, so sometimes we don't learn. All right. As James said, my name is Jason Whitesitt. I'm here today to talk to you guys about tanks, poppies, and the old lie, the evolution of World War I poetry. As a culture, we're obsessed with numbers in the extreme. World War I offers us plenty of both. As you see here, can't quite see it well. Millions of dead, over 21 million wounded, civilian casualties as well, over 7 million of those, widowed. We don't know how many women were widowed in the war. They're often not thought of, but just in France by 1918, over 650,000 women were widowed, lost their husbands, and thousands more never had the opportunity to marry because they lost the men of their generation. On top of all this, we have orphans. These numbers are certainly impressive and tragic in an abstract sort of way. However, they don't tell us much about the war itself, other than that it was deadly. And perhaps not even that so well. Stalin is famous for having remarked that a single death is a tragedy and a million deaths is but a statistic. Thus, we must seek out other sources to understand what the war was like, and this is where poetry comes in. Historians can make you understand the war, and hopefully some of my colleagues have done that yesterday and will today and tomorrow. My job today is to make you feel it. All wars leave literature in their wake, but World War I is unique in that its literature, especially its poetry, so closely mirrors the evolving feelings and attitudes of its participants from start to finish. This presentation aims to track these attitudes from the halcyon days before the war to the first shock of the trenches to the inevitable feelings of anger and betrayal, and finally to the wounded and dead. Over the next hour, you'll get to know and feel the war through the voices of those that lived it. So, I was hoping to read that stuff. I'm going to have to move your presentation just a little bit. Here we go. But the time you see my blood was hot in my veins, how could I stop to examine the why and wherefores, to think things out properly and fairly? A fellow's got to be calm and old and toothless. When you're an old gaffer with no teeth, it's easy to say, damn it, boys, you must not bite. But when you've got all 32 teeth, a man's a savage beast when he's young. So that quote from Zorba the Greek gives us kind of the attitude that young men approached the war before it started, before they met the trenches, before they traveled to Europe. And the poetry here in general, just as a preamble, is primarily British poetry. It's difficult to translate poetry, as we all know. But there was also unique circumstances that gave us a great deal of the British poetry and leads it to survive to this day. So that'll be our primary focus as we look at the poems themselves. So as we begin, prior to World War I, Europe had not fought a war since the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. Thus, you had a generation of young men with no knowledge of war and even less understanding of how recent technological changes might affect it. They grew up listening to stories of their grandfathers, reading Arthurian romances, playing swords in their backyards, and imagining the day that they too might join the battle and fight. but had little understanding of what they would be facing. This is some of the, as is so often the case, in the absence of lived experience, the romantics have their way. And this generation of men were weaned on glorious tales of past battles. We see this in Lord Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade, one of the popular poems at the time. I have a brief excerpt of it here. Forward the Light Brigade, was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldiers knew someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made. All the world wondered. Honor the charge they made. Honor the Light Brigade. Noble 600. It's difficult to find a poem that better evinces the forces acting on young men than this. Here, if you're familiar with the Charge of the Light Brigade, the history behind it, the 600 cavalry were told to charge directly into battlements and cannon. They were nearly entirely destroyed. But as good English soldiers, they were taught to be useful, not to question why, not to question their orders, just to follow them. And so they did. They charged immediately into their cannon and were absolutely destroyed. But this is held up as a glorious thing, right? Brave soldiers dying for their country, not asking why, not stopping to think or worry about themselves, but rather shedding their blood for their homeland. And so here we have, on the eve of World War I, a generation of young men with no experience of war, no idea whatsoever what they were about to get into. Another poem that evinces what they were weaned on, the kind of poetic and cultural legacy they were drawing on, is here.
To Lucasta, going to the wars, by Richard Lovelace. Tell me not, sweet, I am unkind, that from the nunnery of thy chaste breast and quiet mind to war and arms I fly. True, a new mistress now I chase, the first foe in the field, and with a stronger faith embrace a sword, a horse, a shield. Yet this inconstancy is such as you too shall adore. I could not love thee, dear, so much, loved I not honor more.
Thus, honor, expressed as a willingness to battle, is tied to and made prerequisite to all other human virtues, chief among these love. And of course, they also anticipate the common challenges that soldiers face. You know, they don't want to leave their loved ones. But here we see a poem, the cultural background that these young men are breathing, that says, no, if you really love your significant other, you will go to war. That's the valiant thing to do. That's the honorable thing to do. Go forth and fight. The problem for these young men is there was nothing to fight. Their fathers didn't fight, and so they had no idea what they were getting into. I've long been fascinated. As I mentioned, my brother went to war himself, so I've long been fascinated as an English student of English literature about why men go to war, what draws them, even when they know what they're going to face, as these men didn't have the luxury of, but even when they know how bad it's going to be, why would you still sign up for that? What is it that draws young men to go and face what most everyone agrees are terrible, horrible conditions, to lay your life down? What inspires you to do so? Well, prior to World War I, these are some of the inspirations. One, glory. Here we see a poem by Rupert Brooke, who I'll talk about more in a little bit, but this poem's entitled Peace. Now God be thanked who has matched us with his hour and caught our youth and wakened us from sleeping, with hand made sure, clear eye and sharpened power, to turn as swimmers into cleanness leaping, glad from a world grown old and cold and weary, leave the sick hearts that honor could not move, and half men and their dirty songs and jury, and all the little emptiness of love. So in this, we see several different motivating factors. The line, wakened us from sleeping. You have a generation of young men who are idle, who have grown up with no battles, nothing to try themselves against, no metal to sharpen themselves against. And so this is seen as a great, exciting thing. We're going to war, boys. We're going to do something. We're going to make a difference. They're going to be writing poems about us. We also see in clear eye, sharpened power, this notion of physical prowess and wanting to try that. You know, I have 3 boys, but some of you can probably recognize this yourself. It's, look how fast I can run, look how far I can jump. Young men are fascinated with this sort of thing, and it takes a long time to grow out of it. And so you see this desire to want to try themselves in this early poem written from boot camp, essentially, before the actual trenches themselves. We also get mention of honor here, as we saw in Lucasta, a poem that predates this one by several hundred years, and yet that was still percolating in the background. You must be honorable. You must, if you possess honor, then you will go and fight. That's the honorable thing to do. On the side here, I have a quote. I'll read it, and then I'll tell you who said it, that matches this sentiment here, this notion of how lucky we are to live in this time. I was carried away by the enthusiasm of the moment and sank down upon my knees and thanked heaven out of the fullness of my heart for the favor of having been permitted to live in such times. Anyone have a guess of who might have said that? Think to the war that would follow this one. Correct. And Adolf Hitler said that quote right there. So we see a similar sentiment on the German side. Europe was far more united at this time than we often think. During the buildup of the war, we had this idea that they were just chomping at the bit, but economically and culturally, little separated Germany, England, France, even Russia to a large degree at this time. It was a time of great unification. And so we feel these similar sentiments amongst them. We can't wait to go to war. And if you look in each country, you can see pictures of happy young soldiers on the train ready to board and go to the front. Another motivating factor to go to war, in this case we see, is for God and country. And this is from a poem, this is an excerpt from a poem called Into Battle by Julian Grenfell. The naked earth is warm with spring, and with green grass and bursting trees, leans to the sun's gaze glorying, and quivers in the loving breeze. In life is color and warmth and light, and a striving evermore for these, and he is dead who will not fight, and who dies fighting has increase. The fighting man shall from the sun take warmth and life from the glowing earth, speed with the light-foot winds to run, and with the trees a newer birth, and find when fighting shall be done, great rest and fullness after dearth. All the bright company of heaven hold him in their high comradeship, the dog stars and the sisters seven, Orion's belt and sworded hip. The woodland trees that stand together, they stand to him each one a friend. They gently speak in the windy weather, they guide to valley and ridge's end. And when the burning moment breaks, and all things else are out of mind, and joy of battle only takes him by the throat and makes him blind, through joy and blindness he shall know, not caring much to know, that still nor lead nor steel shall reach him so, that it be not the destined will. The thundering line of battle stands, and in the air death moans and sings, but day shall clasp him with strong hands, and night shall fold him in soft wings. Grenfell uses nature here as a means of expressing divine will and a sort of benign predestination. Yeah, bad things are going to happen to you in war, but it's okay. It's part of God's plan. And if you die, you'll be folded softly in soft, gentle wings. It's going to be okay. This is a very abstract notion of death, one in which you have a divine being saying, it's okay. It's okay to die for your country. Nothing bad's going to happen, and nature will take care of you. And it's important to notice the use of nature here because it's going to return once we see the actual poems of the trenches. Nature's going to reappear in a slightly different way. The poets will have a different take. So here we have a poem by Thomas Hardy, who was 73 at the time he wrote it and at the onset of the war. He composed several poems like this to encourage enlistment. So basically, let's rally up the troops, get young men to sign up so that we can send them over to France and Belgium. Men who march away, song of the soldiers. What are the faith and fire within us, men who march away, ere the barn cocks say, night is going gray? To hazards whence no tears can win us, what are the faith and fire within us, men who march away? We see well what we are doing, though some may not see, dalliers as they be. England's need are we, her distress would leave us rueing. We well see what we are doing, though some may not see. In our heart of hearts believing, victory crowns the just, and that braggarts must surely bite the dust. Press we to the field ungrieving, in our heart of hearts believing, victory crowns the just. Hence the faith and fire within us, men who march away, ere the barn cocks say, night is growing gray. Leaving all that here can win us, hence the faith and fire within us, men who march away. As I said, Hardy wrote several of these poems encouraging young men to enlist and go out there. In retrospect, several of his lines are ironic. We see well what we are doing there in the second stanza. And of course, no one had any idea what they were doing in that point. No one had an idea what the technological changes that have taken place, what they were going to face once they actually got into the trenches. We also see here the terrible line, "Victory crowns the just." This is a particularly damaging preconception that oversimplifies a complex war and implies that if a soldier does die or isn't crowned, then he must not have been just. And of course, many soldiers will struggle with this as they begin dying in the trenches. What am I dying for? Is this just? What does it mean if I fail to succeed? And what does success mean even? Another reason they signed up was for boredom. And we still see this to this day. You see the bumper sticker, or the button there says, "Give war a chance." My brother has that bumper sticker on his truck. Here we have a poem by Asquith called "The Volunteer." Here lies a clerk who half his life had spent toiling at ledgers in a city gray, thinking that so his days would drift away with no lance broken in life's tournament. Yet ever twixt the books in his bright eyes, the gleaming eagles of the legions came, and horsemen charging under phantom skies went thundering past beneath the oriflamme. And now those waiting dreams are satisfied. From twilight to the halls of dawn he went. His lance is broken, but he lies content with that high honor in which he lived and died. And falling thus he wants no recompense, who found his battle in the last resort, nor needs he any hearse to bear him hence, who goes to join the men of Agincourt. One can almost see the book of Arthurian tales on this clerk's lap as a young child, a romantic, boyish notion of war, lances, horses, a clean and noble death for his country, obviously ignoring the types of deaths that would take place. So it's romanticized, it's abstract, it's not real, it's something that's easily praised, though not experienced yet. Don't have anything else to do. You want to scrape the gray city, go to war, have these experiences, have these adventures. Another motivating factor was blood. And here we see that in this poem called "The Kiss." Sassoon is my favorite war poet personally, and he, perhaps better than anyone else, his poetry reflects each attitude of the war as it changed. He was lucky enough to survive the entirety of the war, and you could just look in his poetry alone and see the evolution and the changing attitudes. And this is a poem that he was particularly embarrassed of later in his life. To these I turn, and these I trust, brother lead and sister steel. To his blind power I make appeal. I guard her beauty clean from rust. He spins and burns and loves the air, and splits a skull to win my praise. But up the nobly marching days she glitters naked, cold, and fair. Sweet sister, grant your soldier this, that in good fury he may feel the body where he sets his heel, quail from your downward darting kiss. As I said, Sassoon would later be embarrassed of this ode to a bayonet, but it nicely illustrates the desire for martial prowess that a lot of the young men felt at this time. And there we see a lovely recruiting poster from the First World War. That's supposed to be a German soldier there with Lady Liberty in his clutches. Soldiers also joined for brotherhood. We know that few things bind men together as experience of conflict and war. This is a poem called Absolution, also by Sigrid Sassoon. The anguish of the earth absolves our eyes, till beauty shines in all that we can see. War is our scourge, yet war has made us wise. In fighting for our freedom, we are free. Horror of wounds and anger at the foe, and loss of things desired, all these must pass. We are the happy legion, for we know time's but a golden wind that shakes the grass. There was an hour when we were loath to part. From life we longed to share no less than others. Now, having claimed this heritage of heart, what need me more, my comrades and my brothers? We see even today, as so many young men join gangs and other such things, there is this desire, this burning need for brotherhood, to be a comrade in something. And obviously war was an easy outlet for that, a way of bonding with other young men. Here again we have Mr. Rupert Brooke, who was a bit of a celebrity of his age, and a poem, a rather famous one of the more famous ones from the World War I, certainly popular with the enlistment guys, called The Soldier. If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. There shall be in that rich earth a richer dust concealed, a dust whom England bore, shaped, made aware, gave once her flowers to love, her ways to roam, a body of England's breathing English air, washed by the rivers, blessed by sons of home. And think this heart all evil shed away, a pulse in the eternal mind no less, give somewhere back the thoughts by England given, her sights and sounds, dreams happy as her day, and laughter learnt of friends, and gentleness in hearts at peace under an English heaven. So once again, we have this notion of God looking down, kind of offering a benediction on all this. The first line, if I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. A noble sentiment and one, once again, prescient. There'd be many English cemeteries in Belgium and France, and Brooke himself would, in time, come to occupy one. However, not before he encouraged many other men to enlist with poems like this. He died rather quickly into the war, I think in the first year. So those are some of the reasons that men were joining at the time, and why men continue to join wars. The second stage of war poems we're going to look at now, I've entitled Exposure. And here we have a line from Blunden, agony stares from each gray face. And we see that in this picture. So what were the men exposed to? We'll first read one of the most famous poems from the war by Wilfred Owen called Exposure, as we see some footage here from the war itself. Exposure. Our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knife us. Wearied, we keep awake because the night is silent. Low, drooping flares confuse our memory of the salient. Worried by silence, sentries whisper, curious, nervous, but nothing happens. Watching, we hear the mad gusts tugging on the wire, like twitching agonies of men among its brambles. Northward, incessantly, the flickering gunnery rumbles, far off, like a dull rumor of some other war. What are we doing here? The poignant misery of dawn begins to grow. We only know war lasts, rain soaks, and the clouds sag stormy. Dawn massing in the east, her melancholy army, attacks once more in ranks on shivering ranks of gray, but nothing happens. Sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence, less deathly than the air that shudders black with snow. With sidelong flowing flakes that flock, pause, and renew, we watch them wandering up and down the wind's nonchalance, but nothing happens. Pale flakes with fingering stealth come feeling for our faces. We cringe in holes, back on forgotten dreams and stare, snow-dazed, deeper into grassier ditches. So we drowse, sun-dozed, littered with blossoms trickling where the blackbird fusses. Is it that we are dying? Slowly our ghosts drag home, glimpsing the sunk fires glazed, with crusted dark red jewels. Crickets jingle there, for hours the innocent mice rejoice, the house is theirs. Shutters and doors all closed, on us the doors are closed. We turn back to our dying. Since we believe not otherwise can kind fires burn, nor ever suns smile true on child, or field, or fruit. For God's invincible spring our love is made afraid. Therefore not loath we lie out here, therefore we're born, for love of God seems dying. Tonight his frost will fasten on this mud and us, shriveling many hands, puckering foreheads crisp. The burying party picks and shovels in their shaking grasp, pause over half-known faces. All their eyes are ice, but nothing happens. The war was supposed to end by Christmas, but technology favored defensive positions and battle lines hardened like arteries. The war began to drag, and men died as nothing happened. So rather than the romantic notions of charging and fighting hand to hand, men found themselves dying in trenches, not going anywhere, dying while they worked, dying from exposure. Dying from shells, bombardment. 4 days the earth was rent and torn by bursting steel. The houses fell about us. 3 nights we dared not sleep, sweating and listening for the imminent crash, which meant our death. The 4th night every man, nerve-tortured, racked to exhaustion, slept muttering and twitching while the shells crashed overhead. The 5th day there came a hush. We left our holes and looked above the wreckage of the earth to where the white clouds moved in silent lines across the untroubled blue. Here we see a sort of unnatural adaptation. You shouldn't be able to go to sleep when there's shells crashing around you, when at any moment something could land and kill you. But through a sort of strange adaptation, an unhealthy adaptation, men eventually would get to that point and would then spend years after the war, if they survived, trying to get out of that sense, that shell-shockedness, the post-traumatic stress disorder as we now know it. You can contrast this poem, too, with Grenfell's Into Battle. Nature and God here we see is not on our side. At best, he's indifferent. We see that at the very bottom, across the untroubled blue. Nature is a spectator here, nothing more, or at best a spectator. At worst, it's hostile. I promise this is the longest poem I'll read. Another problem for the men who were facing this in the trenches, and something that was unexpected, would be the barbed wire. Barbed wire was new to war at this point, and we see here in a Sassoon poem questions about redemption, and we'll talk about those in a minute. The Redeemer. Darkness, the rain sluiced down, the mire was deep. It was past 12 on midwinter night, when peaceful folk in beds lay snug asleep. There, with much work to do before the light, we lugged our clay-sucked boots as best we might along the trench. Sometimes a bullet sang, and droning shells burst with a hollow bang. We were soaked, chilled, and wretched every one. Darkness, the distant wink of a huge gun. I turned in the black ditch, loathing the storm. A rocket fizzed and burned with blanching flare, and lit the face of what had been a form, floundering in murk. He stood before me there. I say that he was Christ, stiff in the glare, and leaning forward from his burdening task, both arms supporting it. His eyes on mine stared from the woeful head that seemed a mask of mortal pain in hell's unholy shrine. No thorny crown, only a woolen cap he wore, an English soldier, white and strong, who loved his time like any simple chap, good days of work and sport and homely song. Now he's learned that nights are very long, and dawn a watching of the windowed sky. But to the end, unjudging, he'll endure horror and pain, not uncontent to die, that Lancaster-on-Loon may stand secure. He faced me, reeling in his weariness, shouldering his load of planks, so hard to bear. I say that he was Christ, who wrought to bless all groping things with freedom bright as air, and with his mercy washed and made them fair. Then the flame sank and all grew black as pitch, while we began to struggle along the ditch, and someone flung his burden in the muck, mumbling, "Oh Christ almighty, now I'm stuck." This image of the wire, like that of Christ on the cross, who he mirrors here with the loaded planks to cross the ranks, speaks of sacrifice and redemption. Prior to the war in boot camp, it was easy to imagine a noble and clean sacrifice, but here it is literally muddied. But there's no turning back now, as the soldier says at the end, "Oh Christ almighty, now I'm stuck." We could talk all day about this poem, but we'll move on. The poem, another things they faced were little devils, the immortals. I killed them, but they would not die. Yea, all the day and all the night. For them I could not rest or sleep, nor guard them, nor hide in flight. Then in my agony I turned and made my hands red in their gore. In vain, for faster than I slew, they rose more cruel than before. I killed and killed with slaughter mad. I killed till all my strength was gone, and still they rose to torture me, for devils only die in fun. I used to think the devil hid in women's smiles and wine's carouse. I called him Satan Beelzebub, but now I call him Dirty Louse. So we have some gallows humor here, right? This poem about lice, a decidedly unromantic problem, evinces the everyday miseries that define trench warfare. And even soldiers today usually define war by boredom, punctuated by terrible moments of violence. And so a lot of the suffering that took place in the trenches was by simple things like lice that they absolutely couldn't get rid of, the rats that would bed down with them each night, the cold. Usually there would be water in the trenches up to their waist sometimes. The trench we see here is actually a German trench, and they had the luxury of choosing the high ground initially, and so their trenches would be much nicer like this. You'll see in some of the other photos the English trenches, which aren't nearly as well made, and obviously much more suffering took place there. So men were also exposed to work. And this is from a poem called The Working Party. The night when he was busy at his job of piling bags along the parapet, he thought how slow time went, stamping his feet and blowing on his fingers, pinched with cold. He thought of getting back by 12:30 and taught of rum to send him warm to sleep, in drowsy dugout frosty with the fumes of coke and full of snoring weary men. He pushed another bag along the top, craning his body outward. Then a flare gave one white glimpse of no man's land and wire, and as he dropped his head, the instant split his startled life with lead, and all went out. So here we see an example that one isn't killed in epic battle or in mortal combat hand-to-hand, but rather while filling bags of sand, a decidedly unheroic, decidedly mundane death that men faced at any single moment this could happen. So obviously, romanticism before the war, can't wait to get there, we're going to fight and we're going to win. Suddenly they realize the realities of what this war is going to look like. It's not over by Christmas. People are dug in. Forward attacks are stalled and incredibly deadly. And so trench warfare settles in for the duration of the war, in which years, months will go by with maybe 100, 200 yards moved total. And this naturally begins to fester with the men themselves, and anger begins to arise. Here we have a poem by Sassoon. Good morning, the general said when we met him last week on our way to the line. Now the soldiers he smiled at are most of them dead, and were cursing his staff for incompetent swine. He's a cheery old card, grunted Harry to Jack as they slogged up to Arras with rifle and pack, but he did them for them all by his plan of attack. So what were they angry at? They were angry at the rulers. Elegy in a country churchyard, The men that worked for England, they have their graves at home, and bees and birds of England about the cross can roam. But they that fought for England, following a falling star, alas, alas for England, they have their graves afar. And they that rule in England, in stately conclave met, alas, alas for England, they have no graves as yet. So, pretty powerful stuff, especially in Sassoon, but also in Chesterton and some of the others. You really begin to see the anger that was festering in these men, the frustration, the loss of hope, all of it. They start looking for targets, and they find plenty. Bitterness, why does the fight go on, what is being achieved? Men who have no experience of it are sustaining the conflict, or at least that's what a lot of the men believe. The generals, the rulers, here we have Tsar Nicholas and King George. These men have no idea what it's like in the actual trenches, but are nevertheless sending men sustaining the war that has no clear objective. Anger at generals. Base details. If I were fierce and bald and short of breath, I'd live with scarlet majors at the base and speed glum heroes up the line to death. You'd see me with my puffy, petulant face, guzzling and gulping in the best hotel, reading the roll of honor. Poor young chap, I'd say. I used to know his father well. Yes, we've lost heavily in this last scrap. And when the war is done and you stone dead, I'll toddle safely home and die in bed. So once again, a strong indictment of those individuals who don't have personal experience of the war and what the men felt in the trenches. Now, in fairness, a fair amount of young officers and NCOs did perish, but partly out of necessity, the generals seldom were present when men went over the top and died by the thousands. They didn't have to witness it in person usually. Anger at home. Many men felt resentment toward those at home who had no idea about what the actual war was like. I think this is one of my favorite poems from the war, and I think one of the more powerful ones. Blighters. The house is crammed, tier beyond tier, they grin and cackle at the show, while prancing ranks of harlots shrill the chorus, drunk with din. We're sure the Kaiser loves our dear old tanks. I'd like to see a tank come down the stalls, lurching to ragtime tunes or Home Sweet Home, and there'd be no more jokes in music halls to mock the riddled corpses round Bapaume. Soldiers also experienced anger at themselves, at the person they used to be when they were naive before they actually experienced the war. The happy warrior. His wild heart beats with painful sobs, his strained hands clench an ice-cold rifle, his aching jaws grip a hot, parched tongue, his wide eyes search unconsciously. He cannot shriek. Bloody saliva dribbles down his shapeless jacket. I saw him stab and stab again, a well-killed Boche. This is the happy warrior. This is he. And the unspoken last line here, of course, is "this is me." And this is expressed anger, as I said, at the naive warrior he was before the reality of the war hit. There is no happy warrior. There's just the dead and the surviving. And there in the picture we see pictures of those young men who couldn't wait to get to the front to experience the romance of war. Though attacks became increasingly seldom as the war dragged on, men were expected to repair the barbed wire that was blown apart each day by artillery. So men felt anger at futility. This is from a poem called The Wires. Pass it along, the wiring party's going out, and yawning sentries mumble, wires going out. Unraveling, twisting, hammering stakes with muffled thud, they toil with stealthy haste and anger in their blood. Young Hughes was badly hit. I heard him carried away, moaning at every lurch. No doubt he'll die today. But we can say the frontline wire's been safely mended. So once again, these men had to perform these mundane tasks, every one of which was deadly, and they could be killed at any moment, so that the wire could then be blown up that same evening, and they could repeat it tomorrow and the day after with no end in sight. Also anger at the romanticism that defined the war, the pre-war days, the eagerness to get to the front. There's a poem called Suicide in the Trenches.
You're a simple soldier boy who grinned at life. Step soundly through the lonesome dark. His cattle and glum would crumb some lice and lack of rum. He put a bullet through his brain. No one spoke of him again. He smug-faced crowds with kindling eye who'd cheer when soldier lads marked by. Sneak home and pray you'll never know the hell where youth and laughter go.
You can feel the vitriol in that poem, and it's important to remember the divide that now exists between the soldiers who are fighting at the front, 1915, 1916 during the war, as opposed to those at home who have no idea. They still carry around, they see the enlistment posters, they still have all that romantic poetry that was in the air before the war. They don't understand. Some men would write home with letters describing the gruesomeness of the war, but many more of them simply tried to protect their loved ones, and so there was no clear idea. And so naturally in this divide, anger, resentment festered. And we see that clearly in this poem here. God, how I hate you. God, how I hate you, you young, cheerful men, whose pious poetry blossoms on your graves as soon as you are in them, nurtured up by the salt of your corruption and the tears of mothers, local vicars, college deans, oh, happy to have lived these epic days, and he's been to France and seen the trenches, glimpsed the huddled dead. Yet still God's in his heaven. All is right in the best possible of worlds. The war, the woe, even his scaled eyes must see, is partial, only a seeming woe we cannot understand. God loves us. God looks down on this our strife and smiles in pity, blows a pipe at times and calls some warriors home. On earth, the love and fellowship of men, men sternly banded, banded for what end? Banded to maim and kill their fellow men. For even Huns are men. In heaven above, a genial umpire, a good judge of sport, won't let us hurt each other. Let's rejoice. God keeps us faithful, pens us still in fold. Ah, what a faith is ours. Almost it seems large as a mustard seed. We trust and trust. Nothing can shake us. Ah, how good God is to suffer us to be born just now when youth that else would rust can slake his blade in gore, where very God himself does seem to walk the bloody fields of Flanders he so loves. So, not to make light of this, obviously, but in some ways this feels like a post-breakup poem, right? There's sarcasm thick here. There's reference to emotions that were felt before that now seem ridiculous in retrospect. And then, of course, we have the indictment that is the title, God, How I Hate You. The sentence can work, so I hate all of you, the vicars, the college deans, those people that sent me to war, that convinced me to go here, but also God, How I Hate You, an indictment of religion and the loss of faith that took place within some men who were forced to fight in these conditions. Part 4, Casualties. And here we have a quote from Owen. One dies of war like any old disease. The point being that even if you do survive the war, if you're not killed, that you're going to suffer from it for the rest of your life and eventually die from it in one capacity or another. And here we'll see what some of the men suffered. They were shelled from repression of war experience. Now light the candles, 1, 2, there's a moth. What silly beggars they are to blunder in and scorch their wings with glory, liquid flame. No, not that. It's bad to think of war. When thoughts you've gagged all day come back to scare you, and it's been proved that soldiers don't go mad unless they lose control of ugly thoughts that drive them out to jabber among the trees. Now light your pipe. Look what a steady hand. Draw a deep breath. Stop thinking, count 15, and you're as right as rain. You're quiet and peaceful, summering safe at home. You'd never think there was a bloody war on. Oh, yes, you would. Why, you can hear the guns. Hark, thud, 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 quite soft. They never cease, those whispering guns. Oh, Christ, I want to go out and screech at them to stop. I'm going crazy. I'm going stark, staring mad because of the guns. So by this point in the war, we have men who have survived and have been suffering for some time. They're returning home, they're being hospitalized, and once again we see that disconnect where people at home have no idea what they've encountered, what they're facing, and what they're still dealing with through post-traumatic stress disorder, which didn't have a name at that time. They called it shell-shocked, though more often they called it cowardness, failure to properly manage your emotions, the need to man up. There was a great lack of understanding for what the men were facing. And there we have a picture of a shell-shocked individual and another poem by Siegfried Sassoon called Survivors. No doubt they'll get better soon. The shock and strain have caused their stammering, disconnected talk. Of course they're longing to go out again. These boys with old, scarred faces learning to walk. They'll soon forget their haunted nights, their cowed subjection to the ghosts of friends who died, their dreams that drip with murder. And they'll be proud of glorious war that shattered all their pride, men who went out to battle grim and glad, children with eyes that hate you, broken and mad. So once again, an indictment of those individuals who couldn't understand what was going on, the lingering effects that even after, if they do survive the trenches, if they are sent back home, what they faced in the hospitals by their superior officers, men who are asking, well, why can't you go back to the front? We see this in World War II in the famous film Patton, right? He goes into the medical tent and there's a soldier crying, I can't go back out there. What's Patton do? He slaps him, says, get back out there, boy, go fight. So a great lack of this understanding and the psychology of what these men had been through. Here we hear of the wounded in a poem called They. The bishop tells us, when the boys come back, they'll not be the same, for they'll have fought in a just cause. They led the last attack on Antichrist. Their comrades' blood has bought new right to breed an honorable race. They have challenged death and dared him face to face. We're none of us the same, the boys reply, for George lost both his legs and Bill's stone blind. Poor Jim's shot through the lungs and like to die. And Bert's gone syphilitic. You'll not find a chap who's served that hasn't found some change. And the bishop said, the ways of God are strange. Once again, a bit of anger and gallows humor here as men start explaining what has taken place, the changes that did undergo. And of course, the disabled. Everyone always wants to hear the numbers. How many men were killed in this battle? How many died? And there's always 3, 4, 5, 6 times as many men who are disabled and whose rest of their lives are changed significantly. This is an excerpt from a longer poem. He sat in a wheeled chair waiting for dark and shivered in his ghastly suit of gray. Once again, we get that color gray. Legless, sewn short at elbow, through the park, voices of boys rang saddening like a hymn, voices of play and pleasure after day, till gathering sleep had mothered them from him. About this time, town used to swing so gay, when glow lamps budded in the light blue trees, and girls glanced lovelier as the air grew dim, in the old times before he threw away his knees. Now he will never feel again how slim girls' waists are, or how warm their subtle hands. All of them touch him like some queer disease. He asked to join. He didn't have to beg. Smiling, they wrote his lie, aged 19 years. Germans he scarcely thought of, and no fears of fear came yet. He thought of jeweled hilts for daggers and plaid socks, of smart salutes, and care of arms and leave and pay arrears, esprit de corps and hints for young recruits, and soon he was drafted out with drums and cheers. Now he will spend a few sick years in institutes and do what things the rules considered wise, and take whatever pity they may dole. Tonight he noticed how the women's eyes passed from him to the strong men that were whole. How cold and late it is. Why don't they come and put him into bed? Why don't they come? So the war ended in 1918 for a large amount of the populace, the generals, the rulers. It's done. Armistice Day is signed. We can move on with our lives now. But unfortunately, especially with the medical care that was provided and available back then, hundreds of thousands of men had to live with the scars, mental and physical, that they gained from the war. And then finally we have the dead. The poem by Charles Sorley, When you see millions of the mouthless dead. When you see millions of the mouthless dead, across your dreams in pale battalions go, say not soft things as other men have said, that you'll remember, for you need not so. Give them not praise, for deaf, how should they know? It is not curses heaped on each gashed head, nor tears, their blind eyes see not your tears flow, nor honor. It is easy to be dead. Say only this, they are dead. Then add thereto, yet many a better one has died before. Then scanning all the o'ercrowded masses, should you perceive one face that you loved heretofore, it is a spook. None wears the face you knew. Great death has made all his forevermore. This poem, written towards the end of the war, contrasts nicely with that of Rupert Brooke from the beginning of the war. If I should die, think only this of me, that a part of England is forever a part in France, that romantic notion. And here we have a direct response to that. Where is it? Nor honor, it's easy to be dead. Say only this, they are dead. What more can you say at this point? You know, any notions of romanticism or heroism, sacrifice, what was ultimately gained in the war? There's only one thing you can say from the soldier's point of view who lived it, and that's they're dead. Nevertheless, we do have surviving poems that seem to glorify those who died, even later into the war. The most famous of which, still used today on Armistice Day to commemorate the battles, is called In Flanders Field. In Flanders fields the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks, still bravely singing, fly, scarce heard amidst the guns below. We are the dead. Short days ago we lived, felt dawn, saw sunset glow, loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from falling hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If you break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields. So, when this poem was written, the author actually threw it away, but it was picked back up, sent to England, immediately published, and used to send other men to war. Part 5, The Old Lie. On, marching men, on to the gates of death with song. Bow your gladness for earth's reaping, so you may be glad though sleeping. Strew your gladness on earth's bed, so be merry, so be dead. So on Armistice Day, our old friend Thomas Hardy composed this poem. And it's from And There Was a Great Calm on the signing of the armistice, 11th of November, 1918. There had been years of passion, scorching cold, and much despair, and anger heaving high, care whitely watching, sorrows manifold, among the young, among the weak and old, and the pensive spirit of pity whispered, why? Men had not paused to answer, foes distraught, pierced the thin peoples in a brute-like blindness, philosophies that sages long had taught, and selflessness were as an unknown thought, and hell and shell were yapped at loving kindness. Breathless they paused. Out there men raised their glance to where had stood those poplars, lank and loped, as they had raised it through the 4 years' dance of death and the now familiar flats of France, and murmured, strange this, how? All firing stopped? Calm fell. From heavens distilled a clemency. There was peace on earth and silence in the sky. Some could not shake off misery. The sinister spirit sneered, it had to be. And again, the spirit of pity whispered, why? Hardy, at 77 years old, asked this question, and this is editorializing on my part, but there seems to be something somewhat sick about a man who, at 77, who actively wrote and encouraged young men to go and die, to then ask, why did it all have to happen? Why did so many people die at this point? Wilfred Owen has an answer. Of all the World War I poems, this is probably the most famous.
Bent double, like old beggars under sacks. Knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshot. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of disappointed shells that dropped behind. Gas! Gas! Quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling, and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim, through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him, drowning. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If, in some smothering dreams, you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face, like a devil sick of sin. If you could hear at every jog the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children, ardent for some desperate glory, the old lie. Dulce et decorum est, pro patria mori.
Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It is sweet and proper to die for your country. Owen did just that 1 week prior to the armistice, by the hour, 1 week before the wars ended. He survived the whole thing. Wilfred Owen, was wounded, sent to hospital, sent back to the front, earned a military cross for valor, and died just 1 week prior to its end. His mother received the letter informing her of his death on Armistice Day itself, as the church bells were actively outside ringing in celebration. So thus in total, we see the entire arc of the war through the poetry of the British war poets. The romanticism at the onset, the rush to get there, the excitement, the sudden realization of how bad it was, what it was going to be like, the exposure to the terrible tragedies that took place, the anger that naturally festered out of that, and then finally, retrospecting as the war ends, and hope that such a thing would never take place again. And of course, we all know it did, not that many years longer. Questions? What do you say after that poetry, right? Yes?
Just because of the timing and the news that we have nowadays, what is your impression of what the British did at the Tower of London to emphasize World War II with their Poppy Acts?
I don't. I'm not familiar.
The British put up a wonderful display. Filled the moat of the Tower of London with 888,246 porcelain poppies.
Wow.
Which I think is very ironic in all of what's going on in the world today.
Yeah.
To go back and make that simple.
Yeah, it's interesting. You see in this image right here, I mean, this is a moving image, right? We have the romantic sword, the beautiful shot of the poppies on there, and it's always a fine line between commemorating those who died, celebrating those who served. The old quote, hate war, but love the American warrior, right? Same thing there. So where do you draw the line between praising and recognizing those who fought, recognizing their bravery and what they sacrificed, versus praising war itself and not committing the same atrocities again in the future? Immediately upon the close of World War I, you saw poets turn out very pessimistic poems. One of them talks about all the old wizards gathering together and the alchemists saying, well, maybe we should commemorate these people who died. And the other one saying, wait, we might still need these people. What if we need them to all go out and die for us again? What if they need to go die so that their father's sacrifices aren't in vain? And so you see that that political move that countries have to walk or have to sometimes make, in that line between commemorating, honoring, versus promoting and furthering this sort of thing. That's interesting. I hadn't heard about that. Thank you. Other questions? Yes?
I'm sorry I walked a little bit late. Your lecture was very interesting. Poppy, is it for all wars? They still sell veterans poppies you can wear as commemorative items?
Yeah, it was, so in many ways, World War I was the first modern war in which then you have a market for commemoration and that sort of thing. And so we saw the poppies from that Flanders Field poem is actually what inspired them. From that point forward, they were connected with Armistice Day, which then became Veterans Day later on as a recognition of soldiers and a symbol of the sacrifice in the war itself. Correct, yes, that in World War I. And that particular poem in Flanders Field, which was published and bound in books and spread everywhere you could possibly see, it was actually by a Canadian poet who did that. Yeah, that's where it comes from. Yes. Any other questions? Yes. Hmm.
Went along with what happened, what a really strong peace movement
Yeah.
prior to World War II. Those people,
Hmm.
and lets you know
Mm-hmm.
He had the reputation of a warmonger.
Yeah. Yeah, military historians like to say that we're always fighting the past war, not the current one, and that wars, by their very nature, embed themselves very deeply in our psychology and affect the future decisions we make, and sometimes in negative ways. It causes us to get into wars we shouldn't get into, and it causes us sometimes potentially not to go to war when we must. World War II, in many ways, was the perfect war in so much that there was a clearly defined enemy. Like, sociologists look at, there's 3 things that it's okay to kill in pop culture: aliens, zombies, and Nazis. Like, those things you can kill without having any conscience, without feeling bad whatsoever. And it's because there was such a clearly defined bad guy for World War II. And obviously we can talk about following orders and, the average soldier and stuff, but those in charge of the German Reich were obviously bad individuals who needed to be stopped. And so it colors our view of war and who should be promoting peace and when and that sort of thing. It makes it difficult to make good decisions because we're always looking backwards. And naturally, after World War I, a war with a very ambiguous reason for ever taking place, little was gained. The seeds of the peace were actually just those for World War II. And so it is interesting to look and see how each has affected the other. Mm-hmm.
in Britain. I think I'd be here. And the life I've had it not.
Mm.
Was it completely
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, and there's certainly there are the peripheral things that take place in wars. It's no accident the Russian Revolution happened during the middle of this, or the seeds were there and everything. In times of chaos, you have opportunities. Women were allowed to go into the workforce, proved the fact that they could actually do everything that men could do. Wars often can be advantageous for economies and also minorities, people who are typically oppressed. And usually as soon as the war's over, they're like, okay, you guys need to go back to doing what you were and thinking how you were before. And you can't. They so powerfully affect a generation, both those who fought it, but also when they come home and in their absence, what took place, that you can't ever go backwards. And there's going to be pros and cons out of that. Good point. Yes, in the back. Hmm. Yeah. It's challenging, right? We've grappled with that for thousands of years. If you look at the ancient poem Antigone, 2,500 years old, it grapples with that same question. What's worth dying for? When should you dissent? When should you agree? When should you do what the laws of the state say? When you should say no and follow your own morality, whether it's religious belief or personal morals? They're difficult questions to grapple with. And you saw that with the men in the trenches, like that Christmas truce. And Europe was very connected at the time. The rulers were all related. They called, Cousin Willie, and they were related. And they shared a cultural heritage largely deriving from Rome and Greece. And they weren't that different. They sang together that night in Christmas. But then the next day, they had to shoot at one another again. And what forces them to do that? A sense of duty, a sense of brotherhood, protecting the man next to them. What causes you to fight even though when you shouldn't? And we see that from our own veterans in our own time coming back, you know, looking from Iraq or Afghanistan. Oftentimes they don't want to talk about whether we should have been there or not because they were there, and so what did they fight for? And most of them will say they didn't fight for abstract ideas, political notions or stuff. They were fighting for the man next to them, their fellow Marines, their fellow soldiers. But it's certainly perhaps the most important question of our lives. What do we choose to lay our life down for? What's worth it and what's not? And can we trust governments or organizations tell us that? It's hard. Any other questions or comments? All right, thank you guys so much.